It is a pleasure to have you with us this evening. And we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement from Dr. Stephanie Tutors. So I will hand it over to Steph.
Hi, everyone. I would like to acknowledge that we are joining from all across what we call Canada now. And we welcome you to share where you're joining from. And if you have any peoples, any groups that you would like to acknowledge in the chat relating to your heritage, the heritage of where you're joining from, we'd really appreciate that. We want to acknowledge first that this land where many of us are situated, but obviously not all, and in particular where I'm located in alignment with the University of Toronto, and where the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and to be here with you as well. Is such a gift. And I think it's really important to acknowledge at the same time that we don't take these relationships lightly. We don't take our time on this land lightly. And each of us has a different pathway that's brought us to where we are today. And we've talked a lot about that through the writing of this book. It's been a really big piece at the center of this work of trying to do what we can while we're doing it imperfectly to acknowledge that there is still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of misunderstandings, misappropriations, mistreatment, and we need to hold that at the core of what we do as we continue to do this work. So thank you so much for being here with us today, sharing your work and yourselves with us, and joining us to celebrate this book.
Thank you, Steph. That was wonderful. And thank you for everyone putting where you're located in the chat. So this is just the virtual book launch. We will have an in-person book launch in the fall at OISE in the Nexus Lounge, our favorite place. So please make sure you stay tuned for that. And a little bit about how we came to write this book. This book is the product of many conversations over the years, and it also kind of was a springboard from enacting anti-racism and activist pedagogies in teacher education, our previous book from 2023. And while the other book focused more on teacher education, we started thinking a lot about leadership, especially in terms of how leaders navigate through the current climate that we're in with rising hatred and rising right-wing populism, as we've seen not only south of the border, but also very much alive and well in Canada. And I think that there's sort of a tendency to toot our own horn in Canada and say, oh, well, look what's happening in the US. And we're so much more tolerant and multicultural as the narrative, the mythical narrative of the nation state tends to be. Whereas our practices and mistreatment, particularly of Black Indigenous people, are just as problematic and just as violent. So we wanted to look at how leadership is framed and how leadership is constructed through the normative lens of settler colonial, Eurocentric, often heterosexual, male, and ableist lenses. And we wanted to recenter on possibilities to rethink what leadership means and to disrupt these hegemonic understandings, to create space for alternate ways of thinking and alternate epistemologies. So in terms of K-12 education, where this book is really centered, a lot of the equity focus has been on neoliberal approaches to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so much of these approaches have been for performative measures such as EQAO standardized testing on how to, insert equity and diversity inclusion where it and stir. Insert equity, diversity, inclusion into the pot and stir, rather than actually disrupting and dismantling and creating new systems and new ways of thinking about leadership. And so really this book comes at a timely juncture against the backdrop of rising right-wing populism. And we call for activism in leadership. And what might that look like? What might activism look like in leadership? Because activism and leadership in K-12 education are not words that we often hear together. So I'm going to call on my co-authors to also locate and sort of give give an overview of how we came to this work, because we all come from different journeys and different spaces. So Artavan or Andrew, Steph.
I could jump in there, and then I could jump in there quickly. So thank you so much, Zura. I just want to say good evening again to everyone, and it's such a pleasure to work with this team. There's just something that I want to do quickly. Um, because I know of a fact that I see community in the space, and I also see persons like myself who are teachers, educators, leaders, but we're also learners. And I just want to say, as you said, Zura, that this book is coming off the heels of the first one. And it's kind of funny. I want to locate myself by saying how much I've learned from the other authors in this book. I will do presentations in this from this book, and I don't use the chapters that I wrote. I'm using other people's chapter. I'm learning from other people's chapter, and I am so happy to go into this book and do the same. I'm seeing Adam Davies. I see Professor Adam Davies in the room, and I was just scanning some of the just going through. I've read them, but going through them. And so for me, I want to position myself as an activist learner. I'm an activist educator, I'm an activist teacher, I'm an activist, I'm a leader, but I'm also an activist learner, learning every single day from the people who are in this book, but the people who are doing the work, the conversations you have. And so I just want to position myself there. And the last thing I want to talk about is I want to be very clear when we say activist leader. I was reflecting this morning, thinking about the ways in which we do activism through our work, through our writing, because that's what we do. This is what we do, but also through our actions. And the other day I was in a conversation with Halton District School Board, leaders in Halton District School Board, and I use the word and remind them about moral courage that it takes to lead. And we had a very good conversation about moral courage, because everybody wants to be a part of the activism. Everybody wants to be a part of the brave conversation. Everybody wants to be a part of the disrupting. And we want to be a part of the courageous conversation. And until it actually demands us to do that, then I think we start to question our positionality. And so I have had the opportunity to sit with myself and ask myself, well, you say you're an activist leader. What does that mean? And the last thing I want to say in locating myself is we're in a world where we have to stand up and stand behind the books. And so I want to encourage all of us that this is great work and this is needed work. And I can't wait, honestly, Zura, to write more books with you. And I mean that. I can't wait, Artavan, to write more with you. I can't wait, Stephanie, to write more with you, because you and I know how much we learn from each other. We are not just the kind of writers that send something. We spend hours in conversation. I have sat down with Stephanie, Dr. Tutors. I've sat down with Professor Artavan. I've sat down with about Zura, and I'm like, oh, we should actually write this down. So we live this, and I want to encourage all of us to know that we are going to be tested to see if we are in the book or our lives is bigger than the book. And I think our work is absolutely authentic. I have conversation with Dr. Tutors. I've had conversation with Dr. Abawi. I've had many conversations with Professor Artavan Izadaran, and I know for a fact that I'm writing with people who are not just who are not pretentious, who are not performing activist leadership, but they do this in community. They do this when they are not seen. They do this in as co-conspirators in the back. And I want us to understand, when we say activist leadership in schools, we are not just talking being on the front page, being on the front, the visible. We're talking about every single part of activist leadership. And we are aware that many times it's not seen, it's not on the social media tweet, it's not obvious. And so I want to thank you to all those people who are really doing the work of the co-conspirator and the activists in the background. And I'm looking forward to writing more books. And some of you, I see you. I'm looking to write with you as well, to be in conversation with you, in action with you. And so we can record it afterwards in writing. So this is a recording of the work we are doing in community. Thank you so much. Enough love, enough respect. Thank you.
Awesome. I'll jump in there for a few words. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. For me, I think a big shout out to a couple folks. A book is not possible without great contributors, and without great people to work with. The journey can be devastating or it could be really enjoyable. And we must say, we truly enjoy working with each other. It challenges us. And a big shout out to the authors. Not all of them can make it, but some are here and they'll be speaking on their chapters. A big shout out to Huda Salha, who did the book cover, who is of Palestinian descent and does beautiful art. So highly recommend. I'll put her name in the chat to check out. She does a lot of great artwork and is an artist. And for me, I mean, in 2025, activism is like a bad word to use because it's very divisive, right? So what do we mean? I mean, I've been in a lot of rooms and I mean, I'm a critical scholar and I think a lot of words are used very loosely, like even settler colonialism or decolonization. And I think we don't spend enough time actually asking someone like, what do you mean by that? What is your definition? Because a lot of times my definition of decolonization is different from even another critical scholar. So I think with this book, we want people to have those specific nuanced conversation. Don't assume the baseline of understanding is the same for people. And it's an opening to kind of have dialogue. Activism is meant to facilitate dialogue and not debate. And I think that's very, very important. So I just want to read one paragraph, I think, which kind of talks about this. And of course, we focus on the Canadian context. There's lots of happening in the US context, but I think Canada is unique. We can learn from others, but we can also kind of advance our context. So I'm reading from chapter 2 in the book. It says, overall, the ideas presented throughout the chapters build upon the work of racialized and minoritized scholars. And these are a lot of them are heavy hitters in Canadian. So Carl James, right? He's at York University. George Day, University of Toronto. Mohammed Khalifa, Django Paris, Carolyn Shields, Ann Lopez, who's at U of T, Kevin Kumashiro, and David Gilborn to theorize and define activist leadership as an approach that goes beyond mere adherence to policies and regulations. Activist leadership is about aligning policy practices and reforms to meet the unique needs of schools relative to the larger community they are situated in, including the degree and magnitude of systemic barriers influencing the teaching and learning conditions within the school community ecosystem. I'm going to use that word ecosystem with intentionality because each community has its own story to tell, and education and the conditions in that school are often impacted by the community around the school. So, although some things are really great as best practices, there needs to be tweaks to consider local context, and that's important. And the chapters kind of talk about case studies, talk about scenarios across Canada, and all of them have some unique aspects. So, as you read, kind of think about that. Um, I'm going to jump to the critical thinking questions, something for you to kind of think about as you're listening to us. And, the chapters end with keywords and critical thinking questions, which are great, which helps kind of use it as a resource. And question 1 at the end of the first chapter says, think about a time when it was hard to express how you felt as a leader due to external pressures. How did you handle it? And how would you strategize to handle it differently from an activist leadership approach? Um, Going back to that paragraph, there's just 2 sentences. Where such policies and practices do not exist, meaning equitable policies, activist leadership works to create them with community and in partnership with people with relevant lived experiences. Where such policies and practices exist, but fall short of meeting the needs of various stakeholders by being inequitable or unjust, activist leadership works to amend and reform them in a meaningful and constructive way that center the voices and the needs of people in vulnerable circumstances. So I think with that, really, I hope that at least that grounds what we think of activist leadership because we use it and cite it a lot. But in the early chapters, we kind of ground that with the notion of school community ecosystem, think beyond schools, think beyond institutions working in silos, and how do leaders kind of navigate those different worlds, all of them with written and unwritten codes and expectations, to merge the world in a way that is actually, centering the needs of the people. So I'll leave it at there. At the end, if we have time, there's a short poem, which is the last chapter. I'd love to read it, but well, maybe after all the authors present, and I'll pass it on to Steph or Zora if you want to add some pieces before we go to the authors.
Thanks so much, Artavan. One of the things I was thinking about as I was reflecting on this process and looking forward to tonight was the role that we have as editors and the work that we do. Part of the work that we do is in higher ed, teaching perspective and practicing leaders and teachers. And everything that you just said is such a huge, important part of making change in schools and in society as a whole. And it's also such complex work and requires so much of educators and educational leaders. And, I know that we work hard to try to make changes to higher education so that it's more supportive of facilitating the learning that needs to be done to do that work. But we know there's so much more work that needs to be done, and people are going into leadership roles so unprepared to do such important work. And I think about that all the time. And that's one of the things that we talked about when we were writing our own parts of the book, and as we were editing, and we got a little bit of pushback from our wonderful team, at the publishing house. But we really had to ask, who is this book for? Who are we imagining is going to use the book, and what type of work are they doing? What is the context of their work? How prepared are they to do this work? And unfortunately, many people are completely unprepared to do such important work, and it requires such vulnerability, such courage, and is often done against such staunch disagreement and protest, and at such great cost. So I think it's really important to think about that as we're hearing from the authors, and remember that each of the authors came to this project being so willing to be vulnerable and open and honest about their experiences, mistakes that might have been made, the fact that there's still many of us. I'm very much still in a learning phase. I have so much to learn. And I just think it's so important to acknowledge that gift that I feel was given, and sharing that honesty and sharing that vulnerability and allowing us to walk in that learning space with them. And there was a lot of back and forth discussions about how to sort of present the experiences and what kind of an impact it could have. And I really hope that one of the things that we're able to have people take away from this experience is the willingness to go there, is the willingness to do the work, even when it's hard, even when you have to admit, especially in schools, I've been doing something wrong. I made a mistake. I need to do things differently, because it's so important to be able to do that, and to be able to continually be reflecting on what might I need to do in a different way. And especially for myself, I really feel it's important for me as a white woman to just really be thinking about that, especially. And so many of our leaders across Canada are in a similar position to me, and we need to be thinking about how can I step also for me out of positions and work in different ways than other people, depending on their positionality. And it's not always easy to do that if you've thought you have a career pathway that maybe, was your idealized notion of where your career was going to go. And maybe that's not what your community needs. Maybe that's not what your students need. And we need to be able to see that and do the right thing, do the equitable thing. So I can't wait to hear from the authors, to hear more about what they shared, and just to say thank you so much to everyone who contributed. I appreciate it so much, and I know we all appreciate your contributions so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. And you mentioned something very important about not being prepared. And I see this a lot in my 8 years now of teaching teacher ed and ed leaders, aspiring education leaders. It's just teach me what I need to know for my classroom. And it's sort of this focus on the classroom from an aesthetic vantage point, rather than how do I disrupt, how do I dismantle, how do I think about the community, how do I think about integrating the community and what that might look like in my practice. It seems to just be sort of, okay, well, let me go on Pinterest and see what I can do to make my classroom look pretty. And there's still this notion, this norm, and this is how we're attracting people into the profession of what a teacher is, who the teaching profession is for, and ultimately from there, who education and leadership is for, right? And it keeps perpetuating the same status quo. And we get the reports from the review of the Peel District School Board or from other, ministry initiatives that uncovers all of these things. And then there's public shock and outrage, and then it just goes back to the same thing. And having this sort of white passing identity that I have, I've been in very interesting spaces. I was recently in a school